Hello and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark Seven, and as always I'm glad you decided to spend a little bit of your day today listening to me talk about military history. It's cooled off very nicely where I live this week, and it's like the first touch of fall, though the leaves have yet to change. I love the fall, it's such a good time to sit with an interesting story, and so I hope that you'll be entertained by the episode that I prepared for you today. We're going to continue with our examination of the Rif War, fought in the decade of the 1920s in Spain's territories in Morocco. My sources for this one are the same as I've been using for the rest of the series, namely the books The Betrothed of Death by Jose Alvarez, Rebels in the Rif by David Woolman, and Primo de Rivera and Abdel Krim by Shannon E. Fleming, which is a PhD thesis published in 1991. So now, if you're ready, let's get back to the struggle in Spanish Morocco, where we left it last time, after the harrowing Spanish withdrawal from their outposts in the western portion of their protectorate there, including the vital town of Chaouen. Very soon after the terrible experience of this withdrawal in the west, the Spanish were confronted by another rebellion in an up till now relatively quiet part of their Moroccan protectorate, in the rugged and mountainous triangular area between the international zone around the city of Tangier and the Spanish presidios of Ceuta and Tetuan in the northwest corner of the African shore. This was the territory of the Angera tribe. These people were in arms between the coast and had been harassing the Spanish posts here, as well as the roads between Tetuan, Ceuta, and Tangier. The rebels also took and sacked the important town of Alcázar on the Mediterranean coast. In December, the Spanish sent two bodies of troops to put down the rebels here. One, under Franco, proceeded from Ceuta into the rugged upland country to the west, while the second, led by General Saro, pushed north from Tetuan. It would take until the following April for the tribes to be subdued. The method employed was to surround the Angeres and trap them between a network of blockhouses in the sea. A small-scale amphibious landing supported by aerial bombing retook Alcázar and broke the back of the rebellion. The many Angeres fled into the nearby hills to hold out for some time longer. This amphibious operation is of interest in that it can be seen as a dress rehearsal for the projected amphibious landing near Abdel Krim's capital Benakshir, which lay not far from the coast south of the similar shores of Alhucemas Bay. Franco was the officer who developed and implemented this plan as a means of bringing a quick end to the fighting in the Angera country. On the 7th of January, he reconnoitered the coast near the town from the decks of the gunboat Boniface, and returned a few days later aboard another, the Canaleas, to make a closer inspection. It was decided to go ahead with the landing, which was planned for just a few days later, on the 14th of January. A small convoy was assembled to carry the assault troops. The vessels included a gunboat, a Coast Guard vessel, and 3 armed tugs. These formed the escort for 6 K-type landing barges, which were self-propelled craft purchased from the British and reinforced to resist small arms fire. Aboard the barges rode the 4th and 6th banderas of the Tercio, a tabor of the Regulares, a battery of mountain artillery, and some support troops. Bad weather and high waves caused the cancellation of this first attempt. The convoy returned to Ceuta. The operation would not take place until 2.5 months later, on the 29th of March 1925. The invasion opened with bombing and strafing attacks on coastal villages in the area late in the afternoon. The troops, the same as those who had embarked in the first attempt, arrived near the town in the steamship Vicente La Rota, and from there transferred to the landing barges to make the run into the beach. Naval support was weaker this time, consisting only of the armed trawler Arcila, which provided limited gunfire support. The Legionnaires and Regulares nevertheless landed successfully in the darkness, coming ashore at 0100 hours on the 30th. The suddenness of the landing and the firepower of the mountain guns quickly overcame the resistance of the surprised Angera rebels. Very soon the port was in Spanish hands once again. This success opened a critical third front in the campaign against the rebellion here. Though the fighting here would drag on for some months, the landing ensured the defeat of the Angera tribes. The Spanish bombing in support of these operations was, like that of all nations at the time, terribly inaccurate, and some bombs were reported as having fallen into the international zone around Tangier. An international committee of inquiry, commissioned to investigate reports of such incidents, found good reason to give them credence. While they were in the hills along the zonal border, fixing reports of one such incident accompanied with some skeptical Spanish officers, they were narrowly missed by bombs dropped from a Spanish bomber overhead. Elsewhere in the west, as we have noted at the end of the previous episode, the Riffians moved into the power vacuum left by the withdrawal of the Spanish and the weakness of Raizuli. Following the final capture of the old warlord by Abdel Krim's men, tribes which had previously held allegiance to the fallen Eagle of Jannat went over almost entirely to this new power in the land. This transfer of allegiance was given formal existence when the Qaid of Jebel Habib, a senior lieutenant of the fallen chief, who had been captured along with Raizuli, pledged his support and thereby that of Raizuli's subjects to Abdel Krim. The Riffians seized the warlord's arsenal at Tazarut, which was said to have contained more than 100,000 Spanish Mausers, along with ammunition, as well as other supplies of all kinds. That Raizuli's days were numbered in any event can be gleaned by the action of one of his chief supporters, the Caid of Beni Laït, just before his fall. This man, given a letter from the Riffians giving Raizuli one last chance to join forces with them, guessed its contents, and he did not deliver this note to Raizuli, hoping to gain by the warlord's destruction in the battle to come. If his intention was to assure the downfall of Raizuli, he succeeded, but he did not relish his success for very long. His action, or rather his lack of action, was discovered after the battle, and the Riffians immediately shot him to death for having possibly caused so much unnecessary bloodshed. In all likelihood, however, the Caid's treachery was immaterial. Given Raizuli's attitude towards his last few weeks of life spent in Riffian captivity, it is extremely unlikely that this offer would have been accepted. It was during the winter of 1924-1925 that the French first became a factor of prime importance in the Rif War. Always realistic, Abdel Krim had zero interest in a conflict with France, who held the much larger portion of Morocco that extended south and east of the Spanish zone. The Riffians had little in common with the rest of the Moroccan population, from whom they differed in social organization, customs, and language. Furthermore, France was a much more formidable antagonist than Spain, and the Riffian leadership was fully aware of the risk involved with her powerful colonial forces. However, friction, if not deadly conflict, between the Riffians and the French was virtually guaranteed. Like so many political difficulties in Africa then and later, the cause lay in the boundary lines drawn between the zones of control of the European empires. Like those elsewhere in the colonized world, these were drawn on maps over conference tables in the drawing rooms of European capitals, with little reference to the social and ethnological reality of the country, or sometimes even the facts of physical geography. The boundary between the Spanish and French zones of Morocco was based on the river Huerga. This runs roughly east-west along the southern boundary of the Spanish Protectorate, and forms what is considered by the people of the country to be the actual boundary of the territories inhabited by the Riffian tribes. The formal boundary, as determined between Madrid and Paris, however, was a straight line that did not follow the river itself, but ran through it, or sometimes to the north and south of the river as the course meandered and turned. This resulted, as in so many other cases in Africa and elsewhere for the same reason, in tribes, clans, and individual families finding themselves divided by this artificial line. In this case, the border divided the territories of the Metalsa, Ghaznaya, Beni Amart, Beni Bakir, Beni Bouchebet, Gatama, and Ghazawa tribes between the French and the Spanish zones. The importance of this split was intensified by the fact that in the southern portion of the lands of the Huerga Valley were the most fertile lands of the Rif, from which came the majority of its food supply. It is also true that at the time we are considering no more than a tiny number of Frenchmen or Spaniards had ever set foot in these lands. The specific difficulty that first led to a clash between the Riffians and the French concerned just such an administrative difficulty. The lands of the Beni Zerwal fell mostly in the Spanish zone. However, the herdsmen of this tribe migrated with their flocks, and spent part of each year by the river in the heart of the valley, which here lay on the French side of the border. Mostly due to this annual movement of flocks, an arrangement was set up by which the Spanish and French shared out the administration of the tribe between them. The French position among this tribe was bolstered by their use as a puppet of the leader, or Sharif, of the Darkawa, a religious sect with a powerful following in the area, as well as by the self-evident advantages offered by French commerce to the wealthier among the Beni Zerwal. The situation, in which very few Europeans or outsiders of any kind were present, resulted in factions and divided loyalties among the locals, who split their allegiance between Abdel Krim and the French. Thus, it was here that the interests of the Riffians and the French came into direct conflict for the first time. The French were not pleased by the progress of Abdel Krim's armies or by the distress of their Spanish neighbors. Formally, the 1912 Treaty of Fez bound them to uphold the sovereignty of the Sultan. Like any other rebels against his authority, the French had a duty by this treaty to prevent defection or the takeover of any of his territory by the Riffian Harkas. More practically, every victory of the Riffians, or every successful instance of resistance to a Spanish or French initiative, was a threat to the stability of the French Empire, whose inhabitants had much sympathy for this, an indigenous, Muslim leader who had succeeded in defying the control of the European imperialists. Spanish capitulation to the Riffians, and the establishment of a Rif Republic along the lines envisioned by Abdel Krim and his brother, would have very unwelcome effects for the French in Algeria, Tunisia, and beyond, not to mention in their own Moroccan protectorate. For this reason, Primo de Rivera's withdrawal from the position as Shah-in, and the increase in power and prestige for the Riffian leader that resulted, was very alarming to the French. Already, it was being reported, Portraits of the Prince of the Rif and paintings depicting his victories over the Spanish were appearing in the coffee houses and the private homes of French colonial subjects all throughout Africa and the Near East. This alone, in the absence of any aggression against the French themselves, was a compelling reason to make a decisive move against the Riffians. For their part, the Riffians were compelled to contest the Beni Zawal due to their need for the rich harvest of the district. It was also important for them to build up a united front of allied tribes along the southern frontier of the Rif. The Darkawa sect centered here, despite the use of its sharif's influence for the French cause, had many adherents in the other parts of the Rif. This included members of important and influential families. However, the attraction that the rebellion held for the Riffians in the French zone, and for the related tribes nearby, was very much less than it was for those in the Spanish zone. This was largely the result of the approach to colonial administration taken in French Morocco, which was the brainchild of Marshal Hubert Lotay. This man was one of the most able colonial administrators of the period, and one of the most credible personalities involved in European imperialism. His approach to ensuring tranquility and stability in French Morocco, as had been successfully in Madagascar prior to this, was to emphasize and extend the benefits of French rule. Tangible benefits such as increased public security, education, sanitation, and commerce with France on favorable terms were brought to the inhabitants. Otherwise, French would interfere as little as possible in the internal affairs of the people. Once respect for French rule was established, only the barest minimum of force was brought to bear against the Moroccans. This approach won many more supporters than the more exploitative, less beneficial Spanish practice. Its wisdom was confirmed here at the height of the Rif Rebellion. Even with Abdel Krim's prospects at their height, and with independence seeming not only possible but probable, his agents had managed to incite only a small number of the inhabitants of the French zone to embrace his cause. The rule of the French in Morocco was simply much better for the Moroccans than that of the Spanish, and most remained loyal. With the exception of Lotay, French military men who were concerned with what was going on between the Spanish and the Riffians were in favor of seeking an early confrontation. Conflict with the rebels seemed inevitable, and it might as well come when the Spanish were still in the field, and before the erosive effect the resistance of the Riffians had on French colonial interests progressed any further. Though he was opposed to any aggressive move, even Lotay conceded the validity of this point of view, writing in a letter to the French government in December 1924, quote, "Nothing would be so bad for our regime as the installation near Fez of an independent Mussulman state, modernized and supported by the most warlike tribes, with a morale exalted by success against Spain." He went on to describe a possible Rif Republic of this kind as, quote, "In short, the most serious kind of menace, which should be dealt with at the earliest possible moment." He even went on to assert that such a, quote, "maggot breeding spot in the Rif would be a grave threat to civilization and the peace of the West." Despite these sentiments, the Marshal felt that an attack on Abdel Krim would only serve to rally opposition to French rule in Morocco around the Riffian cause, and would thus provoke more trouble than it would prevent. In particular, it was feared that the very formidable Beni Warrain tribe, living in the Atlas Mountains near the important town of Taza, not Riffians but a related people, would throw in with Abdel Krim and renew their hostility to the French. A vicious struggle against these mountaineers had cost the French more than 3,100 men in 1923 alone. Further, costly and unproductive military clashes should be avoided, in Lotay's view, by a strategy of conciliation backed by a strong show of force. This approach had worked against the rebel Sheikh Thami al-Galawi, who had revolted against the Sultan in his domains around Marrakech years before, and had resulted in the rebel becoming a strong supporter and ally of the French there. Lotay wished to apply a similar approach to the troubles in the Beni Zawal, and hopefully come to another such arrangement with the Riffian leader. Abdel Krim, in response, was obstinate in his refusal to tolerate European control of any of his people's lands, or those of the allied tribes. To the Lotay formula of emphasizing the benefits given by French rule, he made this response in the Tangier Gazette, quote, "I recognize that the French have given Morocco order, security, and economic prosperity, but I shall bring the same benefits, with the further advantage that I am a Muslim, and so it will be from a leader of their own faith, and not from an infidel, that the Moroccans shall receive these blessings." He went on to claim that the French were causing the disorders being seen in the Beni Zawal by their arrogant intrusion, whereas he was bringing self-rule and good order. Despite this criticism of French pretensions, he went on to say, quote, "Still, to me, war with France is inconceivable, unless we are attacked." At the end of March 1924, the Riffians made a gesture towards peace, and asked the French to send a party of experts to the disputed area to assist in determining the exact boundary of the Spanish zone. The French rejected this, as it would have constituted a de facto recognition of Abdel Krim's legitimacy. Things came to a head later in the year, when the French announced that the Riffians had attacked a portion of the Beni Zawal territory then under French protection, and had carried off the inhabitants' food stores. The Minister of War authorized an occupation by French troops of the disputed tribal areas in the hills north of the Verga. Most of the troops employed were Senegalese or Algerian soldiers, and they encountered little resistance in their short push north into the highlands beyond the northern side of the valley. Nevertheless, they were easily able to form a fortified line 75 miles or 120 kilometers long, running east-west more or less parallel to the river. Forces involved were placed under the command of General Chambrun, who made his headquarters at Ain Aicha. The fortifications were better constructed and much better laid out than the similar Spanish blockade system, but faced similar problems of supply and security. Though still dependent on resupply, French strongpoints were better endowed with storage for water and other supplies, and could thus wait out a siege more easily. Supply of the individual posts still posed major problems, though, as the area in which this line was situated was completely undeveloped, and lacked even rudimentary roads at first, meaning all supplies were carried in wagons or on pack animals over rough and uneven mountain trails. French posts were most strongly built than the average blockade, though, and almost always sited where they could be supported by the neighboring positions. Also, an airfield was established at nearby Ain Meduna, just east of Ain Aicha, near the geographical midpoint of the line, where 5 squadrons of aircraft were stationed. The French were aware of the difficulties encountered by the similar Spanish defensive systems in the last few years. Nonetheless, they were confident that their defenses on the north side of the Huerga Valley lacked the weaknesses of the Spanish lines, and that their control over the inhabitants of their zone was so much more effective that the rebels would not be able to break it. Many, in fact, held that the Riffian revolt would have been stamped out before it ever became dangerous had it occurred in a French-controlled territory. The Abdel Krim brothers were indeed worried by the French move. Though confident that they could now defeat Spain, they were by no means optimistic about the prospect of a serious battle with this much more powerful opponent. However, to do nothing would be except being cut off from the greater part of the Riffian food supply, and probably lead to further French encroachments along the Verga Valley. Also, for a coalition held together by prestige, to decline a fight against an aggressive move like this, while the Riffians were at the height of their own power, would be disastrous. Nevertheless, an arrangement was still sought, but emissaries sent to the French side were sent back unheard, while the French soldiers continued to dig in. The problem of the new French threat continued to occupy the Riffians' attention throughout the rest of the spring, even as they consolidated their gains in the west among the followers of the fallen Razuli. Despite this preoccupation, they did not allow the Spanish much peace. Small-scale attacks and raids in the Tiziazza area continued all throughout the months of good weather. Fighting here continued the kinds of action seen in the 2 years previously, though on a smaller and less intensive scale. Along that line, things had stabilized into an indecisive slugfest where both sides recognized that they were too weak to dislodge the other. Similar small actions against the new Estelle line, or Primo line, in the west, mostly against the Prussian running south and west from the vicinity of Tetuan, also occurred. These newer and more formidable fortifications enclosed a much smaller area of the western commandancia under Spanish control, but were a much harder and less profitable target for the Riffians, as we have seen in our previous episode. The cream of the Spanish army in Africa held these positions, including the entirety of the expanded tercio. This crack formation, now expanded to 7 banderas or battalions, and a squadron of lancers, had been withdrawn from supporting the lines bordering the central rift near the old Anwal battlefield. These fortifications, like most of the Spanish defenses, were held by regular conscript infantry soldiers drawn from the formation normally stationed in the home country. Though these were still of low combat reliability compared to the crack tercio and regulares, the regular Spanish infantry had benefited from the example set by the professionals as well as by their experience of the enemy gained from countless small actions fought over the previous 4 years. The war had also served to weed out most of the grievously incompetent officers from positions of dangerous responsibility. This meant that the regular Spanish infantry was considerably tougher and better led than had been the case in previous years, and they were much more reliable in the field, especially when used in a defensive capacity. The move north of the Verga by the French changed the power dynamics in the region in such a way as to expose the weaknesses of the Riffian position. The French could afford to wait indefinitely behind their new line in the Benizer Wall. The Riffians, however, could scarcely allow them to remain in occupation there. The question of food supply and the erosion of the prestige which held his coalition together meant that the longer Abdel Krim delayed a confrontation with the French, the more difficult and unstable his position would become. Meanwhile, he continued to publicly assert that the only enemy of the Rif was Spain, and that he would fight the French only in self-defense. The goal of the Rif Republic was liberation, not aggression. On the centennial of the Battle of Ayacucho, the crucial battle fought in Peru which spelled the end of Spanish rule in South America, he was asked by a group of university students in Buenos Aires to write an article commemorating the event. In it, he wrote, quote, The heroic people of Morocco are fighting for the same ideals that Miranda, Moreno, Bolivar, and San Martin vindicated. We possess racial, cultural, and religious qualities that forbid our tolerating dependence on any European power. We, today, are offering our lives on the altar of our national liberty. Among the Beni Zeroual themselves, French influence had become extremely unpopular after the occupation of the northern portion of their lands. Several notorious incidents of French arrogance occurred after they moved north. Typical of these were the beating of a prominent sharif, or religious leader, by a French intelligence officer, and the arrest and execution of 13 of the tribe's leading men on charges of conspiring with the Riffians. This alienated many of the tribesmen who had previously looked favorably on the advantages of French rule. In the early months of 1925, many of the powerful Beni Zeroual who had been cool towards the Riffian rebellion up to that point threw in with Abdel Krim and raised a harka to fight in his cause. Not long after this, the Qaid Bou Manala, France's staunchest supporter among the Beni Zeroual, was assassinated, and the last obstacle to a Riffian move in the territory was removed. Still, the Riffians knew that they could not hope to defeat France in an all-out struggle. Rather, they pursued a plan similar to that which had so far proved successful against the Spanish. That is, they sought to inflict such losses on the French that they would decide that the effort to suppress the rebellion was too costly and destabilizing. By this means, they hoped to obtain their objective, which was to persuade the French to leave their lands alone. In any event, the move was extremely risky, and involved Abdel Krim's forces in a struggle against two European powers on three fronts, in the east and west against Spain, and now in the south facing the French. Still, now that the French were across the Werga, the Riffians were compelled to roll the dice and take on the French as well. French military men were confident in their position vis-à-vis the Rif. Most held a derogatory opinion of the Spanish army, and were sure that the terrible calamities that overtook their neighbors at Anwal and on the retreat from Chaouen could never occur to their own troops. Some explain that the Riffians held the Spanish in contempt as descendants of people whom their ancestors, by which they meant the Moors of medieval times, had once conquered. No such low opinion could embolden them against the French. In any case, most believe the Werga line could handle anything Abdel Krim could throw at it, and couldn't be compromised the way the Spanish defensive systems had been. French Minister of War, Aristide Briand, commenting on the risk of war, told an American correspondent, Paul Scott Maurer, the following, quote, "You have seen the great Abdel Krim. These native chiefs, we know them well. They are really quite simple fellows. Properly handled, they respond to kindness. There is, of course, not the slightest chance that this one will ever attack us." Despite Briand's forecast, the Riffians moved decisively against the French on the 13th of April, 1925. 5 harkas of crack infantry struck all along the Werga line. With little trouble, they slipped between the French posts and struck against the villages of the Beni Zeroual still loyal to France. The attacking forces were drawn from the nearby tribes of the Ghizawa, Beni Yamed, and Beni Mastara. The last of these were the only Riffians from the French side of the border to participate in the attack. They held the country to the west of the Beni Zeroual, and with the others they surrounded the disputed territory on 3 sides. As per usual Riffian practice, most of the attackers were drawn from the local people, with a stiffening of cracked Beni Uruguay regulars, artillery, and picked fighters from the other tribes of the Riffian alliance. Led by the commander-in-chief Mohammed Abdel Krim in person, the Riffians broke through the Werga line with ease. They came in 2 waves, each of no more than 4,000 men. Despite the smallness of their numbers, the Riffians were given an advantage by the years of war against the Spaniards. Though the French colonial army was a much more formidable antagonist than the Spanish army of Africa, it was of the same kind, and the tactics honed against the Tercio and the Spanish fortresses proved effective against the overconfident French as well. In particular, many French officers were shocked at the speed and precision with which the Riffians executed their maneuvers. It may have occurred to them that the previous European advantage largely consisted of better organization and weapons. Given the same weapons, and a similar organization, the Riffians proved very competent opponents. This near parity in the areas wherein European troops usually outclassed their opponents in the colonized world was added to the skill and rapid maneuver and the use of terrain evolved during decades of combat with a more numerous and better armed foe. Thus, the military technique of the Riffian harkas proved dominant here. The offensive took place with no large-scale battle, and consisted, as it had during most of the campaigns against the Spanish, of multitudes of small local actions between forces numbering in the dozens or hundreds. French posts were overrun after desperate sieges, and supply convoys ambushed and captured in the same way the Spanish had experienced countless times in the preceding years. Moving quickly and bypassing or surrounding stubborn points of resistance, the Riffians rushed southwards. Enemies among the Beni Zeroual were slaughtered and their villages burned to ashes. Before long, the rebels had penetrated to within 20 miles, or a little over 30 kilometers, of the historic capital city of Fez, and were likewise closing in on the important cultural center of Taza, another historic city to the east. Worse still for the French, the spectacular advance of the Riffians against them brought nearly all the tribes along the border, most of whom had been cool towards the rebel cause up until now, over to Abdel Krim's banner with enthusiasm. The French were suddenly caught up in the most deadly struggle they had yet faced in their North African empire. The likelihood of just such an attack had been anticipated by Lothair, who had expressed grave doubts about the ability of the French to hold back such a move. As the Rif rebellion progressed and became more serious, he had requested reinforcements from Paris. However, the garrison of French Morocco was actually reduced during the rise of the Riffian threat, from 95,000 in 1921 to 64,000 in 1923, and Lothair's request was refused even as the troubles in the Beni Zerwal continued. The low French estimates of the fighting ability of both antagonists in the struggle to the north of their protectorate may have contributed to this mistake, and now the French would pay for it in casualties. The first response of the French marshal was to call in the nearest reinforcements to try and stem the Riffian advance and halt the defections. This consisted of more colonial infantry and units of the French Foreign Legion coming from nearby Algeria, but these alone were too few to stop the invaders. The combat command in the frontier area was reorganized, and 3 fighting fronts established, with one in the west centered on Wazan under Colonel Colombet, one in the center under Colonel Friedenberg, and one in the east centered on Taza under Colonel Combet. All of these fronts were subordinated to the existing Werga HQ under General Chambrun, established at Ain Icha. The major Riffian pressure was directed against the center of this line, towards Fez. This city held enormous significance to the people of all Morocco, and its capture by Abdel Krim would have incalculable consequences for the ability of the French to maintain control of many of their subjects in the rest of the country. A rumor began to excitedly circulate that the Riffian leader intended to enter the city before the feast of Eid el-Kabir, a Moroccan holiday celebrating the story of Abraham's sacrifice. A sheep was ritually slaughtered as part of this festival, and the Sultan himself normally performed this sacrifice, which was taken to be a demonstration of his role as the true leader of Moroccan Islam. Abdel Krim, it was said, intended to perform this sacrifice himself this year. The opinions of the Fassis, or the citizens of Fez, were divided. Many would have welcomed Abdel Krim, some as a Muslim conqueror and some as a liberator from oppressive foreign rule. However, many others, who were part of the sophisticated Arabicized urban elite, and who felt little sympathy for the Riffian leader, viewed him instead as an uncultured usurper sprung from the barbaric northern highlands, leading an illiterate horde of fanatical outlanders, and hoped that the French could prevent the fall of the city. However, they need not have feared, as Abdel Krim was far too realistic to aim at taking and holding Fez or any other major city. His troops were unsuited to prolonged defensive operations of the kind needed to hold out against French air power and artillery, if forced to hold a compact target such as a city. His aim was always to inflict sufficient losses on the French to compel them to respect his claim to the Rif, not to conquer all of Morocco. The success of his opening attack seemed to offer the possibility of success in this. However, the predictions of a general rising of the Moroccans, or even of the North Africans as a whole, around his standard proved to be much exaggerated. In the event, the legitimate Sultan performed the sacrifice, and toured the tribal strongholds of the districts near where the incursion was taking place. At his request, the people there contributed 5,000 men for the French defense. Here, the wisdom of Lothair's carrot rather than stick policy bore fruit again. Except for those on the zonal border swept up in the excitement of the initial onrush, hardly any Moroccans elsewhere in the territory defected. Most remained, if not loyal, reconciled to the French cause. This stability of French rule elsewhere in their Moroccan protectorate and beyond, and the availability of Moroccan troops as well as African soldiers drawn from further afield to fight in their cause, ensured the eventual success of the French against the Riffians. All that said, the initial onslaught nonetheless met with total success. The stronghold of the puppet Darkawa Sharif was taken, sacked and burned, and the Sharif himself compelled to flee to French sanctuary in Fez. The strong French border fortress at Biban, north of Fez in the Beni Zerwal, was attacked and put under siege in the first hours of the assault. From then until the beginning of June, a series of vicious battles raged around the fortress, which was taken and retaken more than once. The last of the major struggles here became famous for the dramatic last-ditch charge of the French Foreign Legion led by Major Deslans, which smashed into the Riffian positions and routed them out with grenades and cold steel in the manner made familiar by their Spanish counterparts in the Tercio. Despite their obstinate and skillful resistance, the garrison was finally wiped out on the 5th of June, when Biban fell for the last time. Its possession by the Riffians, contested fiercely throughout the whole campaign, would become a symbol of their prowess against the forces of the French Empire. Elsewhere, French positions, like the Spanish blockades, were surrounded and desperate battles fought to resupply or extract the men holding out in them. A difference in the French case was the much more effective air support given to their troops. As the Spanish had found, the aircraft available to the Europeans were not very effective in a close support role against dispersed infantry adept at using the terrain for concealment and cover. Air support was, however, effectively deployed in the form of air supply missions. These took the form of airdrops of supplies, including water in the form of bagged ice, to isolated French outposts. This technique had been used by the Spanish for the identical purpose, but the resources and organization of the French Air Force allowed their air supply operations to deliver many more supplies more accurately than the Spanish Air Force could, and thus have a significant effect across the whole front. The air supply operations were ably organized by a Captain de Lattre de Tassigny, who in the 50s would become one of the principal French leaders in their struggles against another nationalist movement in another French colony, that of the Viet Cong in what was then French Indochina. Stories like that of Vivonne were reproduced all throughout the areas the Riffians and their allies surrounded and wore down isolated French positions. In scenes reminiscent of those familiar in the Spanish Protectorate, vicious close-quarters fighting and unrelenting thirst often decided the issue. One French hilltop post, known as Blockhouse No. 7, was held by 30 men. These soldiers held off an investing force for 15 days. The Riffians waited for their chance to approach by stealth, then rushed the post, and put all the defenders to the knife. Not far from the bloody ground of Vivonne, a small unit of Senegalese soldiers, commanded by a French lieutenant, held the fort of Beni-Dorcoul. In a siege similar to that suffered by the Spanish garrison at Chintafa and the Lucas during the previous year, the French were compelled to hold out alone for more than 2 months, as outside relief columns proved unable to fight their way through to the embattled men. On June 15th, the young lieutenant, Paul Lepere, facing up to the hopeless situation, refused to capitulate and earned himself a place in French military legend. Like his Spanish counterpart had done, he set off his post-powder store as the enemy broke through the last resistance of his exhausted defenders, blowing up the fort and taking its attackers to the next life with him. Many small posts were made untenable by the advance, and were taken or abandoned, and usually razed afterwards by the Riffians. In very few cases did the Riffians defend what they had taken, but instead moved on to further advance. In a number of towns, such as Lausanne in the west, the threat became so serious that European nationals were evacuated to safer points towards the coast in anticipation of the town falling to the rebels. Alarming as these rapid advances and constant movements of the invaders were, they were a sign that the incursion was more of a large-scale raid into French territory rather than an attempt to conquer and occupy it. As the Riffians usually gave up what ground they had gained and moved on, the French were eventually able to stabilize the situation and re-establish a defensive line. Though the Riffians were able to penetrate and operate behind this barrier with relative ease, the apparent threats of a march on Fez and a general rising of the country had passed. French reinforcements totaling 60,000 men were brought in, and held a line running from Lausanne to the Algerian frontier. These troops were primarily foreign legionnaires and Algerian and Senegalese levies. The French had found that their advantage in artillery and air power was less useful than had been hoped against the Riffians, who had learned how to nullify similar advantages with the Spanish. As a result, the new troops allowed them to hold their line and contain Abdel Krim's offensive, but left them still too weak to mount a counterstroke of their own back into the Rif. This was the situation as spring turned to summer, and it became increasingly clear to the French that, despite their reluctance to cooperate with Spain, some such collaboration was going to be essential to defeat the Riffians. The French were perhaps justly worried that association with the Spanish would tarnish their own reputation amongst the Moroccans, but the consequences of Abdel Krim's spring offensive forced their hands. Briand, now a French foreign minister, began discussions with the Spanish ambassador in Paris, Quinona de Leon, about potential Franco-Spanish cooperation. Primo de Rivera proved amenable, and in June representatives of the two countries met in Madrid. It took a month to reach an agreement, but a tentative plan for coordinated action against the Riffians was adopted. This gave France and Spain rights to send their troops into one another's zones, but only in pursuit of a retreating enemy. Further provisions pledged them to a precise definition of the zonal border, and to refuse to make separate terms with the rebels. Despite his aggressive move into the French zone, Abdel Krim publicly kept to his line that the Riffians' only quarrel was with Spain, and that he had reluctantly attacked the French after their campaign of encroachment and provocation in the Beni Zarwal. He let it be known that he would be open to a negotiated solution, but only one that took as its basis Riffian independence. The new European allies were not desirous of a continued costly bloodbath in Morocco, but were inclined to make an offer. Nonetheless, prestige considerations on both sides made the actual opening of negotiations difficult, as both sides had compelling reasons to wish not to be seen as suing the other for peace. However, in July of 1925 an offer was unofficially made to the Riffians. This promised broad autonomy in most matters, as well as, quote, such autonomy as is compatible with existing international treaties. In effect, the Franco-Spanish offer would have resulted in a practically independent Rif under the nominal suzerainty of the Sultan, and through him the protecting powers. Little limitation would be placed on Riffian military power, and the European military presence in the area was to be reduced to a few delineated posts. Talks were held between representatives of both sides in Tetuan and at Tangier. In the final form of the Franco-Spanish peace offer, the sovereignty of the Sultan's government in the Rif was explicitly guaranteed by the Spanish to be only nominal. Many of Abdel Krim's advisors counseled acceptance of this offer, as it achieved most of the goals of the rebellion and represented a significant gain for the cause, without foreclosing possible progress towards total independence later. Despite this advice, the brothers, taking the decision together, declined, chose to hold out for total independence, hoping that their current position of strength would hold long enough for them to wring more concessions from the Europeans. While these negotiations went on, the war continued in the Werga River region. By the end of June, most of the Riffians had been compelled to withdraw north of the river. All the French posts on the northern side, however, had been lost. Riffian raiding parties, some of considerable strength, continued to slip through the lines and cause havoc on the southern side. In one major raid, the airfield at Meduna, where the French squadrons supporting the campaign were based, was attacked and its fuel storage and buildings burned down in a violent battle that cost the French heavily in damage and casualties. By the end of the month, the rebels had taken 43 of 66 French forts. They captured an estimated 51 pieces of artillery, 200 machine guns, 5,000 rifles along with millions of cartridges, 60,000 grenades, 35 mortars, and thousands of rounds of artillery ammunition. 70 Frenchmen and more than 2,000 colonial soldiers of African origin had been captured, and no one knew how many killed or wounded. To top it off, powerful tribes in the region of the city of Taza had joined the revolt and put the city under serious threat. Europeans in the city were hastily evacuated to the coast. Here, at least, Laute's army dug in and held, and the threat to Taza was held off. Everywhere else, it seemed, though, the French were in retreat. The French public looked on aghast at the massacre in Morocco, and looked for someone to hold responsible. The opprobrium for the disaster fell on Laute's shoulders, and in July the long-serving marshal was replaced as commander of French forces there by General Nalin. Laute remained in Morocco, though, in his post of resident general. The Great War hero Marshal Pétain was sent to the battle zone to make a thorough inspection of the French army and its position. The marshal's report revealed the weakness of the French position, which had been pointed out by Laute in the previous year, and made no attempt to downplay the seriousness of the French position there. Reinforcements, preferably drawn from the Metropolitan Army, were requested. Pétain estimated that French numbers would need to be at least doubled to cope with the present situation. As a result, 100,000 new soldiers were rushed to Morocco, and the defense of the colony put into the marshal's hands. As the French reinforcements reached the line, their presence began to tell. Already the French outnumbered the rebel Harkas heavily in the field. In an interview with a Spanish businessman during the summer, Abdel Krim was asked how he hoped to hold out against an enemy that would soon outnumber him 10 to 1. He made this response. Out of every 10 Frenchmen, he explained, 2 or 3 would be out sick or exhausted by the summer heat. 4 would be detailed to guard the convoys. This left them with only a 3 to 1 advantage in effective fighting men, and these 3 would be too heavily equipped to match the Riffians' mobility, and would also be unfamiliar with the country and the terrain. Thus, he reasoned, 1 Riffian actually held the advantage over 10 Frenchmen in this struggle. This high estimation of the Riffians' fighting ability was shared by many among their opponents. The Spaniard, Enrique de Mences, described the highly effective tactics he had seen them use to advantage over and over again. Quote, Abdel Krim's characteristic fighting tactics are to withdraw and retreat while the enemy advances, but at the first halt of the latter, to start sniping, at which the Moroccans are experts. It is very difficult to shoot them down as they never collect in large groups, but in isolated bevies which are constantly on the move, whereas the French and Spanish troops, moving in concentrated masses, are easy targets. Even among the generally disdainful French, the Riffians had earned respect. One colonial veteran echoed de Mences' sentiment, referring this time not to technique but to fighting spirit. Quote, They are magnificent fellows, these Berbers. They do not know the word surrender. One of them will engage a whole patrol. They never run away. I admire them and I love them, but I'll kill them on sight. One specialty of the rebels' tactics that proved unnerving to their European antagonists was their seemingly uncanny ability to move silently and get in among their enemies' encampments and positions at night by stealth. It was not uncommon for sentries and guards to be surprised and quietly dispatched with the knife, and guns and other supplies stolen from the camps while the soldiers remained sleeping. The French, for their part, started sleeping with their rifles tied by cords to their wrists to prevent this. Even so, the infiltrators, time and again, slipped in, cut the cords, and just as often the owner's throat, took the rifles, and got back out undetected. Some foreign legionnaires felt that the losses from this type of silent attack were so frequent that they were underreported in the official figures, so as not to shock public opinion. But more conventional military techniques were also applied with the efficacy and effect which continued to surprise the French and Spanish well after the beginning of hostilities. In particular, coordination of infantry and artillery, and the technique of the latter, were very competently employed, so much so that the chauvinism of the Europeans often refused to accept the evidence of their senses, and instead of crediting these native forces for their skillful employment of modern arms, insisted that the tribesmen must be led or advised by European renegades, probably German ones. This is not true. Though some European specialists were employed by the Riffians in technical capacities, very few held positions of any importance. Performance of the Riffian war effort was entirely the result of their own leadership. As was happening elsewhere in the colonial world in these years, European imperial powers were finding that as soldiers, their subjects, when armed with similar weapons, were quite as formidable and capable as their counterparts from the industrial nations, and, as would be the case elsewhere, they were paying for their underestimation of their enemy. However, the Riffians had serious trouble of their own. A typhus epidemic, which would rack the Moroccan population for the remainder of the war, laid many of their fighters low. A poor harvest and fighting in the Werga Valley breadbasket area compounded the difficulty of survival by adding hunger. In military terms, the picture was gloomy, despite very creditable tactical performance. A series of tactical errors on the part of allied tribes also cost them dearly. In these cases, the rebels abandoned their normal tactics of movement and instead concentrated to hold strong points or fortified villages. These operations exposed the weakness of Abdel Krim's troops in the defense. Unable to exploit the terrain to nullify it, the Moroccans presented a compact target to French air and artillery bombardment, which took advantage of this rare opportunity and decimated them. The aforementioned fortress of Biban, which had been taken from the French in early June, was one such focal point. Repeated battles for its possession cost the Riffians thousands of casualties, and they could scarcely afford these losses. Already heavily outnumbered at the onset of the campaign, the situation became much worse as the French mobilized further reinforcements. By the end of the summer, the French had more than 160,000 men in the operational area, which would have been bad enough alone, but to this army was added more than 200,000 Spanish. This massive manpower imbalance meant that the prospects of Riffian success had become quite remote. These advantages accruing to the Europeans as their mobilization against the Rif progressed began to show towards the end of the summer, and a general French recovery along the zonal frontier. By the end of July, for example, French forces led by Captain Henri de Bournazel had routed the tribes threatening the city of Taza in the east and ended the danger there. This man was another leader of the type seen in Franco during the early portion of his combat career with Tercio, and he also frequently exposed himself to danger to set an example of courage for his troops. Rather than appear on a conspicuous white horse as the Spaniard had, however, the Frenchman made himself prominent by appearing on the field in a bright scarlet battle dress. French troops under Friedenberg, supported by a column of tanks and armored cars, had also defeated the thrust towards Bazan in the west. On the 10th of August, the French and Spanish armies met up for the first time at Arbawa, a position in the western valley of the Lucus, and ended the danger in the far west. As European numbers swelled, they began to push back, eventually culminating in a strong push north of the Werga Valley in mid-September. Little coordinated opposition met this big French drive, and after a short advance of 4 days, the march north was halted by Pétain, after all the French territory taken in the initial onslaught had been won back. This included the embattled fortress of Biban, which had become a symbol of triumph over the French to the Riffians. This met little opposition, and the marshal was sharply criticized at home for halting it after so short an advance, but the leader seemed reluctant to advance into the Spanish zone. While the major campaign against the French was being fought, pressure was kept up on the Spanish lines by Harkas in the east and west. In addition to the usual border clashes and small-scale investments, the Spanish under General Sanjurjo in the Melilla area were forced to deal with the rising of the Beni Said. However, this insurrection was short-lived, and the Spanish themselves made few offensive moves in the summer of 1925, and continued on the defensive, gathering strength for the joint offensive being discussed in Madrid. The centerpiece of the combined Franco-Spanish plan was the long-discussed amphibious landing on the shores of Alhucemas Bay. This indentation in the shore lay in the center of the Spanish-Moroccan coastline. It had good shelter from the wind and a suitable beach, and most importantly gave directly onto the mountains at the heart of the territory of the Beni Uruguay. This was the heart of the rebellion, and the capital of the Rif, Ashtir, less a city than a close grouping of villages, was located a short distance inland from the favorable landing beaches. A thrust from the sea here, Spanish officers had long advocated, would be the logical way of striking at the heart of Abdel Krim's power, and would obviate the need for Europeans to fight on unfavorable terms across the mountains and highlands of the Rif. A sudden landing, supported by naval firepower, and a quick advance, could take the enemy capital and break the back of the rebellion. The French, with their very low estimate of the military capacity of the Spanish, were reluctant to begin any kind of joint planning. They expressed serious doubts as to the Spanish ability to pull off such a complicated operation, and had no wish to be involved in another Spanish failure. Given the experience of the amphibious operations of the Great War, chiefly Gallipoli, their hesitancy over the project was not unjustified. A few factors nevertheless acted to change this attitude. One was the increased willingness to cooperate brought about by the reverses inflicted on the French by the Riffian attack that we've mentioned before. The low French estimate of Spanish competence was also softened by the leadership of Primo de Rivera, who seemed to have inspired confidence among his new allies, and the example of the successful small-scale landing carried out by the Tercio and the Regulares at Alcazar Seguir during the fight against the Angera revolt. The dictator was not alone in advocating such an operation as the obvious solution to the troubles emanating from the Rif. The idea had been discussed as far back as the pre-Treaty of Fez period of Spain's involvement in the territory that would become the Protectorate. Tentative plans for such an operation dated from at least 1909. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Africanista element of the Spanish army was very enthusiastic about the idea. Not least among them was Franco, who, when discussing the plan with Primo de Rivera, declared that, quote, "It is not only possible, but necessary." Plans were made for the landing, and for the operations of the French with which it was to be combined, during the summer. Lotay originally put forward a plan for a landing in the area of the Wad River Valley, near the old Tercio post of Woodlow, followed by a drive towards Chauen to retake what had been abandoned the previous year. The Spanish held out for their own plan, and as they would be providing almost all the forces to execute it, their way was chosen. In fact, it was the better plan, striking directly at the heart of enemy power. Also, a drive south from here would trap the Riffians between the oncoming European offensives. The Riffians would be contained between the defensive lines in the east and west, and then crushed between the Spanish drive southwards and the northward advance of the French. Finally, the date was set for the landing. Though some French naval support would be provided for the Alhucemas Bay operation, the great majority of the forces involved, including all the troops of the landing force, were to be Spanish. As usual, the shock troops would be the Tercio. 4 banderas, the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th, would make up the vanguard of the Spanish attack. It represented a fifth of the total invasion force. The attack was scheduled to go in on the morning of September 7th, not long before the French push from the south was slated to begin. In the weeks leading up to the date of the attack, the Spanish made practice landings near Ceuta and Melilla, while the soldiers of the landing force were drilled in disembarkation and close-quarters grenade and bayonet tactics, that were the principal method of dealing with the trenches and fortifications they expected to meet on the assault beaches. The Spanish had a good idea of the kind of preparations being made by their enemy, having kept the area under observation from the air, including a personal reconnaissance by General Sagnoro on the 20th of August. The Riffians were by no means unaware of the Spanish plan. The idea of the attack on the bay had been discussed frequently in the last 4 years, and even if it hadn't been, the vulnerability of this area was obvious enough to have occurred to them. The only question was when the blow would come and how it would be aimed. The Riffian leaders decided that the most likely place the Spanish would come ashore was in the area of the Guias River, where it meets the coast, and in consequence they strongly fortified the beaches in this sector of the bay's shoreline. As the end of August neared, the invasion fleet assembled in 2 parts, one each at Ceuta and Melilla, including French and Spanish warships, troop transports, and landing craft. In the air, a small armada of seaplanes and land-based bombers, as well as an airship, was prepared to support the landings. In the days immediately preceding the attack, these latter overflew the mountains of the Beni Uruguay and scattered leaflets. These announced the imminent invasion of the Rif, with the intention of punishing Abdel Krim, and gave the tribes a period of 3 days in which to surrender. In response, as David Woolman writes, quote, "The rebels of the Rif merely consigned themselves to the will of Allah and checked their rifles." This was not the entirety of their response. As the invasion approached, the Riffians launched an attack in the Tetuan sector designed to throw the Spanish off balance, and if possible, cause them to delay their planned assault long enough for rougher autumn weather to become a complicating factor. This diversionary attack was directed against the fortress of Kudia Tahar, near the city, part of the Estella line. No mere feint, this was to be an attack in force by some of the finest troops of the rebel alliance. Preparations for the assault were just about finished on the 5th of September, when the Spanish invasion fleet sailed from Ceuta and Melilla. The Harkas gathering around Kudiat-Tahar included the best and most seasoned fighters in the West. They included the cream of the Riffian's Jabali allies, and were led by the veteran commander Ahmed Herrero. They began the assault by surprise, having stealthily positioned 9 pieces of artillery and a ring of machine guns close in around the Spanish post. The attack began all at once on the 6th with an intense point-blank barrage from the Riffians that decimated the shocked defenders. No respite was given to the garrison, who were closely invested and relentlessly attacked over the coming days. By the 12th, the 200-man garrison had been reduced to 34, of whom 22 were badly wounded. The Kudiat-Tahar attack achieved part of its objective when part of the Tercio, already embarked and at sea en route to the rendezvous off the landing beach, was called back to Ceuta to rush to the relief of the embattled post. The units called to the rescue of the fortress were the 2nd and 3rd Banderas, along with a regiment of regular infantry. In their by now familiar manner, these 2 Banderas formed the vanguard of a relief column which was assembled and set out on the 11th to lift the siege. Once they passed the post of Ben Karish on the way, they were in heavy combat all along the remainder of the route. They were repulsed in their first attempt to break up the Riffian investment on that day, when the rebels met the advance of the Legionarios with well-directed fire from entrenched positions. The next day, however, supported by machine guns and mortars, Tercio broke into the Riffian and Jabali lines and forced them from their entrenchments at the point of the bayonet. The rebels regrouped in the hills and caves nearby, and were finally driven from the area on the 13th, when the pitiful remnant of the Kudiat-Tahar garrison was relieved at last. The dogged and extremely determined defense put up by the Spanish at Kudiat-Tahar was an extraordinary performance for any soldiers in any army, and the fact that these were regular conscript infantry underlined the fact that by this point in the war the Spanish army had toughened up enough that the Riffians no longer had the moral ascendancy they had exercised over them in previous battles. Few survivors, when they at last made it back to Tetuan in safety, were personally given a cigar and a bonus of 25 duros, or about 4 contemporary dollars, by Primo de Rivera. Despite its timing and the violence of its prosecution, the attack in the Tetuan sector succeeded only in diverting a small amount of the Alhucemas Bay force. The operation went forward. The invasion fleets, under the command of Admiral Yalif, set off from Melilla and Ceuta to rendezvous off the bay on the 5th. Ships and troops, as well as the aircraft assigned to support them, were divided into 2 forces, one based on Ceuta and one on Melilla. The Ceuta force is commanded by General Saro, the Melilla force by General Fernandez Perez. Each invasion convoy carried 9,000 men, among them 2 banderas of the Legion. Franco, with the 6th and 7th, was to form the vanguard of Saro's column, and 1 bandera each sailed aboard the battleship Jaime I and on the steamship Capitan Segarra. 2nd and 3rd banderas, under Lieutenant Colonel Balmes, were assigned to Perez's command and sailed in the troopship Antonio Lazaro. Attempts were made by both flotillas to deceive the Riffians as to the actual point of attack by bombardments and simulated preparations for landing at other places along the coast. Ships coming from the west bombarded the old Tercio post at Udlao and made simulated preparations to come ashore there, as well as at a few other old Spanish posts in the nearby area. The Melilla force engaged in this direction as well, and made a feint towards Sidi Dris, where they bombarded the shore and laid a smokescreen. Landing was postponed once the Spanish began to arrive due to unforeseen strong east-west currents in the vicinity of the landing beaches. The next day, however, the attack went in. The execution of the landing operation was supervised by Admiral Yolif from the bridge of the Spanish flagship, the 12-inch gun-armed España-class battleship Alfonso XIII. He was accompanied by the dictator and General Sañoro, who was in overall command of the Spanish effort. His French counterpart, Admiral Hallier, aboard the battleship Paris, looked on and oversaw the operations of the French naval forces involved. The troops and supplies were carried aboard a total of 63 cargo ships ranging between 900 and 4,000 tons, some converted into troop transports, on loan from the Spanish Compañía Transmediterránea. Each man carried his rations, ammunition, grenades, and a gas mask, in addition to his personal weapon. In addition to the naval support of 36 Spanish warships and a few from the French Navy, landing was supported by 88 land-based aircraft and 12 seaplanes. Specially built floating docks for use in landing and the subsequent seaborne supply of the forces ashore were also constructed and towed to the scene. On the morning of the 8th, the ships opened up a fierce bombardment on the shores of Valhasamus Bay. The planes joined in, flying numerous strafing and bombing sorties against the beach defenses. Spanish fire did not go unanswered. As they had more than once so far, Riffian artillerymen brought their pieces out and answered back to the ships offshore, scoring a few hits on the Spanish flagship and forcing her to withdraw beyond the range of Riffian artillery. However, these softening up actions were part of another diversion. While the beaches inside the bay were being pounded, the troop ships and landing craft swung around to the northwest, out of the indentation in the coastline formed by the bay itself. Fire support was then shifted to this stretch of the coast. The Spanish Air Force was very active throughout this foggy morning, logging a total of 1,462 flying hours on missions in support of the landing, dropping a total of 150,000 kilograms or 330,000 pounds of ordnance. At 0900 hours, the troops of the landing force boarded the K-type landing craft, which were then towed by armed tugs to within about 1,000 meters of the shore. Lines would then be slipped, but the barges run into the shore under their own power. Troops would be landed on the beaches of Ishtan and Sebadia on the coast west of the promontory known as Morro Novo. The planned landing beach was found to be full of unexploded aerial bombs, and so at the last minute the landing craft were diverted some distance to the west. These narrow beaches were in the territory of the Koya tribe, somewhat uncertain allies of the Beni Uruguay, and they proved to be lightly defended. The landing craft were ready and started in at 1140 hours, the men of Tercio led by Franco leading the first wave. The novelty of this operation was the inclusion of pro-Spanish Moroccan fighters, organized in their customary fashion, and recruited from among the non-Riffian subjects of the Protectorate. These men, organized in the so-called Harkas de Tetuani Larache, accompanied the Tercio in the attack on the beaches. The water was shallow, and the assault boats grounded on gravel and sandbars in the shoal water, forcing the legionarios to go over the side and wade in through water up to their necks. Nonetheless, supported by the fire from the sea, Franco and his men seized the beaches at Sebadia and Ixtian, overwhelming the defenders by the sheer ferocity of their attacks out of the surf, capturing an artillery piece and several machine guns. The legionarios then pushed off the beach and over the low cliffs beyond, and by 200 hours the landing grounds were secure. By nightfall, they had cleared the defenders out of the heights of the Morro Nuevo, where the standard of the Six Bandera was planted and unfurled in token of victory, and were digging in to secure their beachhead before moving inland. 8,000 men and 3 batteries of artillery were put ashore that day, for the loss of only 7 officers and 117 men, some of whom were reported as having been killed by their own naval gunfire. The success of the initial landing waves was all the more welcome as the effect of the assault on Kudia Tahar now manifested itself in the landing operation. News of the dire situation in the Tetuan sector had reached Primo de Rivera aboard the Alfonso XIII when the amphibious assault was beginning. He conferred with San Yurio and decided to send the Antonio Lazaro, with the 2nd and 3rd Banderas aboard, who were even then preparing to go ashore to follow up the success of their comrades, back to Ceuta at full speed to restore the situation. They were joined by a regiment of the regular infantry. In total, 4,000 men out of the 18,000-man assault force were diverted from the invasion by Ahmed Herrera's attack. Once the situation in the Tetuan sector was resolved, however, these units would head back to Ceuta, where they would board the freighter Escalano for Sebadia Beach, where they would disembark on the 20th, join the other 2 banderas and the rest of the Spanish invasion force once more. Despite their initial success in getting ashore, and though the Riffian capital was only a short distance to the southeast of the landing grounds, the Spanish faced a grueling campaign. The Riffians recovered from their surprise and redirected their forces to drive the invaders from the area around Ixtan and Sebadia. Fierce and tenacious counterattacks were launched against the beachhead on the 11th and 12th. These attacks were formidable, and were pressed home with a ruthless tenacity that tested the Spanish defense to the limit. For the attack on the 11th, the Riffians hit the beachhead with 1,500 men, 200 of whom were so-called Juramentados, which were fanatical men sworn to die in battle. Bloody as these actions were, they failed to drive the Spanish back into the sea, and behind the contested perimeter more and more troops and guns came ashore. Not long after the counterattacks were beaten off, the Spanish began their drive towards the capital. The route to Ashtir from the Spanish beachhead led south then east, and through broken and rocky country. Though the distance was short, it crossed numerous ravines and rocky peaks covered with large rocks and riddled with caves. The terrain could hardly have been better suited to the type of guerrilla defensive tactics that were Riffian's specialty. One unusual feature of the fighting that accompanied the Spanish advance in this case was the Riffians' use of their artillery only at night, so as to avoid giving their position away to Spanish air observation. As would recur in similar asymmetric struggles later in the century, Riffian gunners would hide their guns in places of concealment, wheel them out to fire a short barrage, then quickly move them back into cover or onto new positions. So effective was the Riffian defense that even though they commanded a large, well-trained, well-equipped, and highly motivated force, Spanish commanders ashore, such as the future conspirator General Godet, could only manage an advance of a few kilometers in the first 15 days of heavy fighting. On the 23rd, joined by the 2nd and 3rd Banderas back from the Tetuan sector, this man's troops broke through to Calcameda, a sandy cove on the northwestern shore of Alhucemas Bay itself. This place exemplified the type of difficulty posed by the terrain here, as the beach was enclosed by sheer cliffs riddled with caves, each one of which had to be cleared by his soldiers individually. How obstinately this terrain was defended is illustrated by the Spanish experience during the assault on Monte Malmusi, a peak which dominated the entire area of the landings, beachheads, and the subsequent advance. On the same day as Goded's men were fighting among the caves of Calcameda, 12,000 Spaniards stormed the Malmusi Peak. The battle for this vital feature was so bitter that when the summit was reached, the Spanish found only a single Riffian defender left alive, and this man continued to fire at the oncoming troopers of the Tercio until he was finally dispatched with bayonet thrusts. The assault on the peak had cost Franco's 6th and 7th Banderas, in the forefront of the assault, 44 killed and more than 120 wounded. In all the fighting that occurred this day, the Spanish lost hundreds of soldiers. Fighting in these actions was even more savage and relentless than usual. The Riffians contested every boulder, ravine, and escarpment in their effort to keep the Spanish from their capital. At least 200 bodies were found on Monte Malmusi. The Spanish captured another cannon, 4 more machine guns, 300 rifles, and hundreds of hand grenades. By the 30th, the slow advance had pushed on over ravines and boulder-strewn hills to Monte Palomas, the last strong natural feature between them and the Riffian capital. Following a preliminary artillery bombardment, an assault led by the 6th and 7th Banderas along with units of the Regulares advanced against the rebel positions on the mountain. They were held up by strong resistance at a place called Lomao. The Spanish dug in and brought their automatic weapons to bear along with an intense mortar barrage, and under the cover of these support weapons mounted a fierce bayonet charge which broke into the enemy positions. Riffian resistance on Palomas collapsed. The way to the capital lay open before the Spanish. It wasted no time, and by the 2nd of October the men of the Tercio were in Ashtir. It should give a measure of the ferocity of this battle that at this point, the objective of a 3.5-week-long advance lay only 7 miles, or a little over 11 kilometers, from the landing beach. The rebels had fought so obstinately and skillfully that despite the Spaniards' use of naval artillery, air attacks, and even poison gas, they were only able to advance on an average about 400 yards a day against the much less numerous defenders. The 3rd, the Riffians had been pushed out of Ashtir, which was burned by the Spanish. The battle came to an end. A garrison of 13,000 Spanish troops was encamped in the area of the bay. The Alhucemas Bay operation, although very costly, had been a clear-cut and decisive victory for the Spanish, the only one that they could be credited with during the whole of the Rif War. The Spanish public greeted the news of the taking of the Riffian capital with elation. Finally, it seemed, something was being done to end the futile war across the Gibraltar Straits. General Sanario, as well as Saro and Fernandez Perez, were feted and promoted. Primo de Rivera was decorated by the king, receiving the Grand Cross of the Laureate Cross of San Fernando, Spain's highest military honor. Francisco Franco, the first-ranking Spanish officer to land, saw his military reputation and legendary aura enhanced by the Alhucemas Bay operation. His penchant for appearing conspicuously on the battlefield yet remaining unharmed was to further reinforce his air of the man of destiny in the vicious fighting after the Cebadilla landings. Though denied the bright white charger on which he customarily displayed himself during the fighting around Tiziazza and elsewhere, Franco still found ways to seem imperturbable while in harm's way. In one famous incident, which became a prominent episode in his personal legend, he was completely buried by rocks and sand thrown up by a bursting shell as he came ashore with the first assault wave. His loyal legionarios dug him out, only to find him unhurt and laughing as usual. As a result of his exploits leading the Tercio in this operation, he was promoted to brigadier. At 33, this made him the youngest general in Europe. Even the judicious Lotay was to express his admiration for the man, saying, quote, "Spain has only one man in Africa, Franco." The move into the Beni Uruguay homeland from the sea coincided with the French drive north from Huerga. Though these 2 blows hit the rebels heavily, they by no means snuffed out their will to resist, which continued unabated. One sign of this came not long after the triumph at Ashtir, against the soldiers establishing permanent positions in the Alhucemas area. A position known as Casamata was established in a sector of the new defensive lines held by the 2nd and 3rd Banderas. As they had done in earlier campaigns, the Spanish were establishing a network of strong points to hold the country through the approaching months of bad weather. A sudden night attack by a Riffian Harka caught the post at Casamata by surprise, killing or badly wounding every man there. The next day, the 2nd Bandera moved in and occupied the stricken fort, but the night attack and the move to retake it had cost the Legion 14 dead and 33 wounded, including the commanding officer of the unit involved. Throughout the rest of October, and into November and December, the Spanish would continue to hold a contested line in the Ashtir area, all the time harassed by artillery and mortar attacks, constant sniping and machine gun fire, and raids and ambushes of the kind so familiar in this war. Losses to these causes just among the Tercio would total 20 killed and almost 80 badly wounded before the end of the year. Meanwhile, the jaws of the European trap began to snap shut on October 8th, when a Spanish column moving south from Dardrius met a French detachment at the village of Zoco el Talada, the territory of the Metalsa tribe. The next week, the principal military leaders of each side present in Africa, General Sanario and Marshal Petain, met at a place called Zoco el Sept de Enmar in the territory of the Beni Buhahi, a tribe in the southeastern portion of the Rif. Spanish general would become the new High Commissioner of the Spanish Protectorate on the 2nd of November, when Primo de Rivera, satisfied that the Moroccan War would resolve itself without his personal supervision after the success at Alhucemas, relinquished the position himself. At the end of the month, the dictator traveled to Alcazar-Quivir in the far west to meet with the leadership of French Morocco and coordinate their plans to complete the victory over Abdel Krim. The Riffian government had relocated to Tamasit, in the rugged mountains of the central Beni Uruguay after the fall of Ashtir. The situation of the rebels seemed bleak. Cut off from the most productive parts of the Rif, they faced hunger and a continuing typhus epidemic. Their fighting men were tired after 4 years of continuous struggle, and their homes had in many cases been burned or destroyed by Spanish bombing. Not only that, they were surrounded now by more than 500,000 victorious and confident Spanish and French soldiers. Still, Abdel Krim's forces held the greater part of Spanish Morocco, and many of the Harkas of the local tribes were undefeated. The oncoming winter would slow down the advance of the European forces and lessen their ability to exploit their victories the last 2 months. It seemed hopeless to continue to hold out for victory now, but a mixture of martial pride, patriotic feeling, fear of the consequences of defeat, stubbornness, and the faint hope of a Franco-Spanish rift or some other unforeseen circumstance coming to their rescue at this late date kept the Riffians in the field. Nevertheless, most knowledgeable observers predicted the struggle would be over by next spring, or by the following summer at the latest. And this is where I'm going to end this episode. Hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. The successful landing in Alhucemas Bay was a high point of Spanish military practice, a difficult and risky operation that was brought to a victorious conclusion. Though the campaign fought against the short distance from the beaches at Ishtan and Sebadia to Ashtir was brutal, casualties were less than expected, and less than was typical for this bloody war. This amphibious operation was the only large undertaking of its kind between Gallipoli and the German move on Norway in 1940, and the first to achieve a decisive effect on the war it was part of. For our next episode, we're going to continue to the conclusion of this long colonial conflict. Beaten at Alhucemas and on the Werga, and repulsed in the west at Kudia Tahar, the Riffians were by no means ready to surrender. A further campaign to pursue Abdel Krim into the mountains of the central Rif and stamp out his movement once and for all would be required. Also, the diminution of his power would lead to attempts by local warlords to seize control of bits of the former Riffian-controlled lands. We'll detail these final operations in the 6th and last part of this series. After that, we'll return to the embattled Pacific in 1942 and look at the operations of the U.S. Navy's carrier dive bomber squadrons and the SBD Dauntless aircraft that they flew into battle, and the bloody fighting with the still undefeated Japanese Navy and Army in a hard-fought campaign to secure the important island of Guadalcanal. Until then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.